I have another kind of interesting article on the same topic from Forbes entitled, let's see, it's called Don't Revive Boeing by Killing Capitalism. And so what the article does is it takes a look at kind of the finance theory behind big bank bailouts in times of crisis. And it looks at what happened back in 2008, and it looks at whether or not it is right for when bailouts happen. The biggest fear of the person writing the article is that the companies receiving the bailout are going to use the money to basically buy back treasury stock, boosting their stock price in a way that doesn't help the greater good of society. And so it looks at and tries to compare the size of the bailout to the dividends of the last 5 years of Boeing, and may use that to make a claim to say that they have not used that money wisely, or that they won't use that money wisely. And so I guess the interesting point that he makes is that he believes that we should structure bailouts in such a way that the performance of those companies results in payouts to the people who are ultimately investing into these companies, which in this case, I guess, would be the government bailing out these companies. And so I kind of wanted to open it up for discussion on whether or not you thought an equity stake in a business makes sense as a way of distributing a bailout.
Yeah, I mean, in theory, it sounds great, right? I mean, I think, well, it depends on what side of the political fence I think you're on. But in theory, I think most people would agree that if big companies are lent money and then by the taxpayer, the people, then at some point, if they become profitable again, they should have to pay back some of that money in the form of some kind of retribution or repayment of what was lent to them. That being said, though, good luck trying to get this thing passed in the current American governmental system. I mean, if you just look at healthcare, they've tried to get a universal healthcare or some kind of government option for individuals across the country, and that hasn't happened. And if you're going to talk about then the American public, or more specifically the government itself, taking a position in a company, I don't know if that's going to fly in America these days. I mean, I just don't see it happening.
Yeah, I think I guess the way I would talk about this without putting my finger on the scale of global political philosophy is just the way I define the problem. There's no way to talk about this without getting somewhat political, but the suggestion that if the government provides money to a company in a bailout, that the government should then potentially take an equity position in that company, I would say that there's other ways to achieve the objectives that the author was getting at without them taking an equity position. And I think that you can't take lightly the idea of a government, any government, having an equity position in a company, because that's the hallmark of being in the socialist to communist spectrum of how governments are and economies are run. That is government owning the means of production, and that from that perspective, I would say if the objective is to prevent companies and executives from buying back their own stock with bailout dollars, you can make a rule about that specific issue. You don't have to jump to the government owning equity in the company. If the objective is to ensure that the taxpayers who are bailing a company out ultimately get the money back and maybe some rate of return, it is on the socialist side to be bailing out the company anyway, and it would be also somewhat socialist to structure that as a loan with repayment and debt, and have standard commercial debt covenants and certain kind of what we call negative rights that would allow the government to have certain choices about what happens within the board of directors. But at least that form of socialism wouldn't be as far down the path as the government literally owning an equity stake in the company and owning the means of production. And let's keep in mind, the major country in this world right now where the government owns the means of production in a variety of industries is China. So, I mean, that's the kind of thing we'd be talking about. So I'd say my overall point on this is not to, again, put my thumb on whether we should be socialist and communist or capitalist, but to simply say that would be not a simple or a decision to be taken lightly. Not to just say, oh yeah, it makes sense, we should get our money back, so why don't we get some stock in this company and that company. It's not that light of a decision. It would be a pretty profound thing for the government to take ownership in the equity of corporate America like that, in my view.
Yeah, and the article doesn't really make it clear, but I kind of got the feeling that the person writing it intended for maybe the individual taxpayers to somehow be the ones to reap the individual rewards. And so I guess maybe his imagined way of implementing that would be to issue stock to people as individually. But I feel like even that has so many just administrative burdens of implementation that are so difficult to do that, doesn't really make sense.
Now that's a fascinating idea, right?
Yeah.
Make a government investment in the company as a bailout, and then cause the company to issue stock and distribute that stock among the taxpayers, so the stock is not sitting in the hands of the bureaucratic machine that's the government. That's a fascinating idea, but I never thought much about it. It's interesting. Yeah.
Well, and it's also kind of interesting to think about, because it's like, on the one hand, we do look at healthcare and we say, well, that is such a universal good and such a universal need that we all need, that we don't believe universal healthcare is necessarily socialism. But we look at transportation and the airline industry, and we know that, the price of goods is so heavily linked to that it's, whether you use it directly or not, it's just such a core thing to everyone that it's just kind of interesting to define which industries are important enough in the greater good of society to be, relevant to this discussion, basically.
Yeah, and I would maybe, I will kind of parse what you said there a little more carefully, in the sense that certainly there are plenty of people in this country who do believe that universal healthcare is socialism, and academically speaking, I would say universal healthcare is a form of socialism. There are forms of socialism in this country we already have. Medicare is already a form of socialism. When you say it's not something that we necessarily would believe is socialism, I think what you mean is it's not something you and me personally would necessarily believe is a bad form of socialism that's going to end the country's economy as we know it.
I guess what I feel like is there's a lot of people who would subscribe to universal healthcare before they feel like they would categorize themselves as a socialist.
Exactly. Yeah.
Socialist idea.
Yeah. The government owning stock in corporations. Yeah.
Yeah, they hold them in their mind as a separate kind of thing, though, I think. And maybe I'm putting words in the mouths of people who you don't actually think that, but I've gotten that feeling talking to people before. And so, yeah, it's just interesting to think about which goods are of that importance.
Yeah, and I think, if you put that on a spectrum, my perspective on this, and not everyone will necessarily even agree with this point, but if you put that on a spectrum of, capitalism to socialism all the way to communism, and if you're putting that on a spectrum, I should probably go the other way because this is my right hand and this is my left hand. But if you're putting that on a spectrum, it seems to me that the government owning part of the means of production, owning stock in companies, is way farther left on the spectrum towards communism than the government having a single payer healthcare system, right? And so these different kinds of things are all kind of maybe have different levels of socialism to their policies. But yeah, that just speaks to this whole point of it would be an amazing hopscotch to just like jump past universal healthcare, like as AJ said, we can't really agree on, and suddenly have the government own stock in private companies. That would be an amazing game of checkers to just jump right over the opponent that way.
I think the other chess piece in all of this is, if you were, and the reason why I just don't think this would ever get passed is you're talking about a dilution of shares there. You're talking about current shareholders then having their shares diluted by the rest of America. And it would make it, I think, and they have a lot of lobbying power. And so I don't necessarily know that you would be able to even get past, a first round of talks if you're talking about diluting the investing portion of the U.S. economy, investment in large blue chip companies that are supposed to be really big, really high dividend. That yeah, good luck. And that's besides the point of talking about the how some people view like the police and fire department as acceptable socialistic kind of things that we accept are for the greater good and paid for it by everybody kind of thing, where we can't get over the hump on healthcare and all those other pieces. I think before you even get to that point, I think it would be a full stop just based on the lobbying power of investors themselves in these companies.
And I think
Yeah,
it's something,
yeah.
the one thing we're all agreeing on is that healthcare is a more universal good than the airline industry when it comes to it's acceptably socialized.